I would like to describe a field in which little has been done, but in which an enormous amount can be done. This field is not quite the same as the others in that it will tell us little of fundamental physics, but it will tell us much about the strange phenomena that occur just below our perception. In contrast to the natural philosophers of the past, the scientists of this field delve into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. Their quest is to understand and create the imperceptible. After all, there is plenty of room at the bottom.
Hello and welcome to the Materialism Podcast, an exploration of the past, present, and future of materials science and engineering. My name is Taylor Sparks, and I'm here at the University of Utah, and I am not joined by my trusty co-host, Andrew Falkowski. He's away in Maryland doing an awesome internship this summer. Instead, I'm here with who else but Jared. Jared, how are you, man?
Good. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. You're now professor.
Yeah, man, no longer associate professor. I joked with my sister, her window for making Ask Professor jokes is now closed. She had it for 11 years and missed her window. I'm so pumped. Yeah, I got tenure back in 2019. You become an associate professor, and then 5 years later, now promoted. So feels pretty great.
Perfect. Well, we've got a very timely episode. For those who pay attention to sports, the Celtics just won. And we're going to talk about Boston.
There's going to be a lot of traffic, a lot of kerfuffle going on in Boston right now. We're going to talk about the granddaddy of all kerfuffle, I guess unless you go back to like the Civil War era or the Revolutionary War. We're going to cover today another entry in our series of episodes that we've done on engineering failures, right? If you remember, we did an episode on the Titanic. We did one on the Camp Fire, on the de Havilland Comet, on the Challenger shuttle, and we have another one today on the Big Dig. So brace yourself for a Taylor Jared special, the only second time ever of doing this. We're going to dive into the Big Dig. Okay, Jared, what is the Big Dig?
So the Big Dig is essentially this idea of getting rid of the overground highways in Boston and putting them underground. And so what happened is Boston, when it was designed, it was not designed for cars, obviously. It's a very old city for those who don't know. So they put this thing called the Central Artery through Boston, and it's just this.
It's a mess, dude.
It was this disgusting, huge highway, and it was an elevated 6-lane highway. I think there was a joke somewhere I saw that they called it the other green monster in comparison to Fenway Park, which I thought was funny. But it was just ugly, and people wanted to get rid of it because when you got rid of it, if they went underground, you'd free up more land, and also you could build a better highway system. That one of the big goals was actually to connect, I think, where the waterfront was to where the airport was, to actually give more places to go.
And this is back in the 80s. So in other words, Boston was out musking Musk before he was even thinking about underground freeways. They were already thinking about this. And the whole process of getting the money appropriated for it, at the time, they thought this was going to cost $2.8 billion, which was an expensive infrastructure project. But they deemed that it was worth it. And in the 80s, they sort of lined up the finances, and they begin the project in 1991.
Well, it was really necessary. There's a reason they got that money. They were saying that I think by the 90s, it was carrying 200,000 cars a day. And they had estimated that if they didn't fix it by the 2010s, it would be 16 hours of traffic jam a day.
I mean, Boston's already, I lived there, right?
Yeah.
After the Big Dig was done, and it was still traffic jam city. So I can't even imagine. Okay. So I'm all for like big ambitious projects that make sense financially.
Mm-hmm.
This one is actually, an example of what not to do in hindsight when it comes to building these big things. It took way long. It took 16 years. It was massively over budget. It ended, remember, they predicted it was going to be $2.8 billion, I think, and it ended at, almost $15 billion?
I've seen some different numbers, but I think $15 billion is the safe number. I believe that is what Massachusetts cites it as, so we'll stick with that.
In other words, this was one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in history at the time.
They considered this to be the most expensive highway project ever, dwarfed by only one, and that was the creation of all interstate highways.
So absolutely nuts. So anyways, we're not here to talk about the policies and the boondoggle of how long it took and the mismanagement of that project necessarily. What we are here to talk about is a materials engineering failure. So help me understand what went wrong, Jared.
So when they had actually begun building the Big Dig, they realized that they needed to suspend the ceiling to actually get a ventilation system in there because it's underground and under a river. So you need a lot of air flowing through it.
So like in your home, you might have seen like a drop ceiling before, right? That way you can hide your pipes and your air vents. You don't see them because you've got this dropped down ceiling. But in your home, you probably use like that, what are those ceiling tiles made of? It's like cardboard, basically. It's this super thin stuff. That's not what they used in this tunnel. What did they use?
So they used concrete sections, just entire sections of concrete. And
these were 100 millimeters thick. They were 3.5 meters by 2.5 meters, basically.
And they were somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 pounds.
Yeah, so it's basically like a truck.
Yes.
Like, these are very heavy panels overhead.
And so they went to this consulting agency, and they had actually designed this system of adhesive anchors to support these huge 6,000 pound panels. And so they'd used epoxy and steel framework to do this, actually.
Yeah, so they take these screws. Now, remember, you're working overhead. You're drilling up into the concrete, and you're going to try and hang this extremely heavy concrete panel. And there's lots of options. You could do a threaded screw. You could do an expansion bolt. You could do an undercut, or you could do an epoxy, right? Those are sort of your 4 options. They decided to go with an epoxy anchor. So if you're like a rock climber, there's been like a big move away from expansion bolts towards epoxy anchors in the rock climbing world. So maybe you're thinking that's a great idea. Actually, because these were hanging upside down, best practice really would have been undercut. Yeah, they decided to go with epoxy.
It is worth noting that the consulting agency, they did say that undercut was the best thing, where an undercut anchor, for those who don't know, it's just a hole that's drilled wider at the base, deeper than the concrete, and then the anchor expands up in there.
That's right.
And then the hole smaller at the top. So that was their idea, but the managers on the project, they actually didn't like that idea, and they said, no, we want you guys to use adhesive.
Okay. So now I think you can already see the problem. You've got these extremely heavy concrete panels hanging from the ceiling, and they're basically glued in place.
Yeah, and it's funny because we're going to get to obviously a big failure, but the failure started early on. When they had first started opening portions of the tunnel in the late 90s, they had already found that there was parts sagging because even though they were designed to support like really heavy loads, it just wasn't working, but they couldn't figure out exactly what was the issue. So they just replaced the anchors and tried again.
There were so many other problems, right? They were actually using this concrete, this ready-mix concrete imagine there's a lot of concrete they used here, and it was really subpar. And actually a company that was manufacturing it ended up getting indicted for fraudulent practices. There's since been many investigations on this, and they found 3,000 tunnel leaks that had to be repaired. There's problems with, you're digging a tunnel under an active city, right? And there's water, and this was an incredibly difficult project.
And they weren't monitoring it very well. I think even when they figured issues out, they just kind of fixed it and let it be instead of, actively monitoring anything moving or issues like that.
So there were a number of warning signs that were found before anything awful happened. Here was one. It said the ceiling panel designer warned, and this was back in 1997, right? The project, remember, finished in about 2007. So this is way before it's done. The panel designer warned that this epoxy might not be strong enough and that it could fail due to the heat coming from a fire if there was a fire there. And then in 1999, the contractor wrote the construction manager that 5 ceiling bolts in the high occupancy vehicle lane, right? The carpool lane,
yeah.
right? They had pulled out up to 50 millimeters in only 2 months after installation and had passed a pullout test. So that is crazy. That only 2 months in, you're already losing bolts. They also found that when they were drilling the hole into the concrete to then place the bolt in it and epoxied in place, they were using a diamond coring bit. We've talked about diamond. Check out our previous episode on diamond cutting tools. But since diamond is such a great cutting tool, it cut a very smooth shaft. And because it was really smooth, anybody who's tried to glue things, you typically rough it up first, right? If you've patched your bike, there's a reason you scuff that tube because you want it to stick better. This is leaving it super smooth. And the other problem is that they said that it left a residue that wasn't cleaned for a week, after which time it was difficult to remove and it resulted in 20% less bond. So there's already sort of problems coming up. Good thing is that there was some testing going on. They did test these bolts up to 125% of the design load. So if it was supposed to hold, 5,000 pounds, they're loading up to 6,000 or whatever. And then after they found a few bolts pull out, it says that the construction manager required that the load during this testing be increased to twice the design load. So now they're pulling it at double what you'd expect, which is good. But still, where does that 2x come from? If you've taken my Intro to Material Science class, you know that safety factors of 2, that's not the way to go. We should be thinking in terms of probabilistic failure. What's the probability of failure? Anyways, So they had to do that. And after they did that, the contractor stated that since nearly all the ceiling panels had been installed, it was now going to cost $600,000 to remove or brace the panels to test these bolts. And since they didn't want to test them all, they did what was a pretty big mistake. They only tested the bolts in the HOV lane. And their rationale was this. They said, if no bolt fails here under these higher loads, then the other lanes would probably not require testing. So they made an assumption that all lanes were sort of not equal, but rather that the HOV lane was the most severe, and so they only needed to test it. But what they found is that over the next 8 months, only 8 months, 187 bolts that were tested had 19 pull out. And then, so it says, but since 17 were in the so-called mock-up area where the workers were being trained on how to do bolt installation, they just chalked it up to the fact that these guys were inexperienced with the epoxy and that they would learn as they were going and that the problem probably no longer existed. Pretty awful. So what did this all lead to, Jared?
So it's worth noting that when they did this, they were opening it in sections. And one of the sections they opened was called the Fort Point Channel Tunnel, which connected to the Big Ted Williams Tunnel. And someone was driving there July 10th, 2006, and a section measuring 20 by 40 just fell. Now, very incredibly luckily, only one person was killed and one person was injured. A 38-year-old Milena Del Val, I believe her name is, and her husband, they were in the car and it fell on them, and she passed away and he was just injured. It's very lucky when you consider the size of the debris that nothing else really happened, but it launched a huge investigation into it.
Yeah, so you said it was a really large area that fell. The way that these panels, they were big rectangles basically. So obviously at the corners is where they came together. And so at these intersecting connection points, this is from the wiki page talking about it, where several of these individual bolts were all anchored to the roof slab concrete, there was the failure of a group of them, and now you've lost several bolts all at once. So that caused a chain reaction, which caused several other adjacent connection corners to fail. And in short, that's why you ended up losing 26 short tons. So 52,000 pounds of concrete ultimately falls down to the road below. So absolutely horrific that this happened and that somebody died. But you can imagine after the fact, there's this demand. What happened? What went wrong? This was we took a long time to build this. It was extremely expensive, and we still had this catastrophic failure. So obviously they want to know what's wrong, and they start demanding answers.
Yeah, so immediately after a local Utah boy, Mitt Romney.
Yeah, he was governor at the time out there.
He just ordered a full audit by a engineering firm, and they went through it. And then, of course, also the National Transport Safety Board looked into it. I think a few other people all looked into it for different reasons, because this was a big concern, because while they had closed this tunnel off, obviously, there was still a lot of other things they had built. So I think there was just concern about the entire project as a whole being safe. Yeah,
in the aftermath, they found that there was 242 potentially dangerous bolt fixtures that were still supporting tiles. This is after the collapse. So in other words, had they not done anything, there's a good chance that this would have happened anyways.
When the National Transport Safety Board had finally concluded, they had decided that the root cause was the epoxy.
Yeah. So the company that made it, this was Powers Fasteners Incorporated. They were charged with involuntary manslaughter. They ended up paying $16 million to dismiss the charges, and also paid $6 million to the family of the lady who was killed. Absolutely horrific. And then this one statistic I think was really interesting. The total amount of the cost of the epoxy used on this D Street portal, that epoxy from buying it as a supplier was only $1,200 basically. And yet it led to the redesign, inspection, and repair of all these tunnels, and that was over $54 million, all in choosing the wrong material.
Yeah, the company that actually made the epoxy, I think, later had to up all of the safety factors like we talked about, just because it wasn't enough.
Absolutely. So we're going to get into what went wrong, but before we do that, we got to talk about epoxy. I don't think we've done an episode on epoxy, Jared, so let's do the basics of epoxy really quick. And it's one of these things where there's a lot of OChem, there's a lot of reactions. So there's some visuals I wish I could show you, but we'll just talk through the big picture stuff for a moment. First off, what are epoxies? If you haven't used them before, you probably have, and you just didn't even realize it. If you've ever taken an adhesive where it came in 2 tubes and you had to mix them together, either you squoze it and they mixed automatically in the tip, or you had to, paint, to sort of mix it with a Q-tip or something. That was an epoxy.
Most people have probably used the JB Weld, that clear weld.
Yeah. So all epoxies have some things in common. They all have a molecule, and there's different types of molecules, but at the end of that molecule is the epoxide group. So an epoxide group, what is that? It's a little triangle, right? It's 2 carbons bonded to an oxygen in a triangular shape. Now, obviously, you have to do your electron counting, and you realize that it's not just carbons and oxygens because you have to make things count up. You'll realize quickly that the carbons each have 2 other bonds, right? So on one carbon, it's going to have 2 hydrogens. The other one's going to have 1 hydrogen, and then it's bonded to some functional group. And that functional group has a huge amount of variety. There's loads of different epoxies out there, but they all have this sort of triangular carbon-carbon-oxygen little triangle sticking off the end. And that's going to be important because that epoxide group is what we're going to use to make a thermoset polymer. So remember, if you've taken an intro to MC course, thermoplastics are the ones that you heat them up and they melt. So like your G.I. Joes, right? You heat those up. Hopefully you're not.
Hopefully
Sid. Not. But thermosets don't do that. These things form strong bonds all the way through. They are 3-dimensionally bonded. There's not just like van der Waals bonds holding them together that you can melt easily. These things form strong bonds, so that we call them thermosets, okay? Now, I said that the functional group off the side, that there's lots of different ones. So there are bisphenol A epoxy resins, there's cycloaliphatic epoxy resins, trifunctional, on and on and on. There's so many different types of epoxies. And they all kind of have their different pros and cons. That side group on the side can be really big. It can be hundreds of atoms or thousands, right? And so now you have this idea that you can tune the molecular weight. So if you want an epoxy that's really thin, like water, so it has really good flowable characteristics, you might choose a low molecular weight. If you want one that has a really high molecular weight, right, then that might make it more like a viscous liquid or even a solid. There's some that have double bonds, which can be broken later on and cause problems with stability. And there's some that are fully saturated, like only single bonds. So that's like your cycloaliphatic. Because there's no double bonds that can be broken, these ones tend to have really good UV stability. They weather really well. They have good thermal properties. There's these so-called trifunctional or tetrafunctional epoxies, which is basically saying like how many different directions do they have to connect, 3 or 4 or what?
What makes it fast set? That would be a good thing to mention.
Yeah, so let's talk about curing. There's lots of different bases, right? Including, by the way, biological polymers, which is really cool. You can actually stick these epoxies on the end of like fatty groups.
Mm-hmm.
You can put them on the ends of, glycerol and fatty acids to make biodegradable epoxies if you want them to break down over time. But you're asking about whether or not they set, right?
Yes.
So, and how they set. Is it a fast set or a slow set? Does it require temperature or not?
Yeah, so the big reason that's important is when they had designed this, for some reason they'd chosen a fast set epoxy by Power Fasteners, which is not the typical choice for doing this, obviously, because, you know, as we all know in materials, when you gain a property, you tend to have to compromise somewhere else.
Yeah. So so we've started with our base monomer of epoxy. If you want to turn that into a 3-dimensional, strong, mechanically rigid structure, you have to start bonding these little monomers together. If you've seen the basics of like a chain, reaction polymerization, this is going to look like one of those. Except that what we have to do is we have to take that little triangle of carbon, carbon, oxygen. We have to split it open. So now it's going to create a free radical on the end of it that can go and attack another epoxy ring and split it open. So what do you do to split that open, right? That's the curing process. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. The most common way to do it, or the most basic way, is with an amine group. An amine is just a nitrogen bonded to 2 hydrogens. So you've got your little carbon, oxygen ring on one side. Now, if that gets in proximity of this NH2 group, what's going to happen is you have, due to what's called nucleophilic addition, right? Basically, the nitrogen wants to bond with one of those carbons, but they each have one bond too many as it is. So what they do is they each kick off a hydrogen, right? Or, well, the nitrogen kicks off a hydrogen, the amine group, but the carbon kicks off the oxygen. So now the hydrogen and oxygen that got kicked off are bummed, but they find one another. And so they form this hydroxide group, and then you are able to form the bond. Now that kicks off a free radical on the other end, which can just keep this reaction going. Yeah. So that is amine curing, and that happens sort of as a catalyst. It's very easy for that to happen, but it's not something that you can control. Like once you put those two things together, they're going to react, which is why if you've ever worked with JB Weld or whatever else, you have a window of time before you can get that done because it's going to set up. As soon as you mix the amine with it's probably an amine or something with an amine group on it with your whatever your base epoxy is, you have a limited amount of time.
It's a race against time.
Yeah. So there's other ways to go about it, right? You don't have to use an amine. You can do alkali groups that will cure it. There's anhydride curing agents where you basically provide a catalyst and then it goes forward. There's catalytic curing agents, and these have different pros and cons. One of the big advantages, though, is longer pot life. So if you're selling this, epoxy and it's going to sit on the shelf for 2-3 years, you need to make sure that 2 years later, when somebody buys it, that it's not going to be completely, solid. And then there's this question about time, which you asked. One of the big things that you'd like is obviously you want it to cure uniformly all the way through and as quickly as possible if you could help it. If you just take an amine group and you put those two things together, they're pretty fast. So, for example, if you take like one of the most basic epoxy resins, DGEBA, that stands for diglycidyl ether bisphenol A. It's one of the classic epoxies. And you expose this to UV light, they find that it is 90% cured. So all the bonds that are going to be made, you've got 90% of them made in about 40 seconds. So that is pretty fantastic to be able to very quickly create these bonds. And it doesn't have to be UV light. It can also be temperature. If you heat the thing up, that could be enough to to catalyze those reactions going forward. But this is a choice that you have in which epoxy you use, whether you choose a room temperature setting slow one, which is going to set very slowly, or a fast set, which tends to be more controllable. But the ultimate properties of the final epoxy will be different as well.
Yeah, so this difference in properties is actually what really caused this whole issue. So the fast set epoxy that they were using was more susceptible to creep and really not good for this application. But before we get into that background, let's actually talk about what creep is.
Yeah, I know we've covered it before in the show, but just a reminder, creep is time-dependent plastic deformation.
Yeah.
In other words, if you pull on something with a load, it might stretch or bend or compress or whatever right immediately, or maybe that deformation is going to happen really slowly. And we just call that creep, right?
Yeah.
So we already read that, for example, when they tested, after just 2 months, they found that a bunch of these bolts had stretched out, pulled out 50 millimeters, right? So they'd been creeping already.
Yeah.
So obviously, if that's only 2 months, you can imagine over long periods of time, it could creep to the point where it just comes out and fails entirely.
Yes.
So there is a difference on whether you do a fast set epoxy or a slow set epoxy. And they knew this, right? They knew that fast set epoxies where you UV light cure it or something like that, they should only be used in cases where it's not going to be applied for long terms, because then you don't have a lot of time for creep to accumulate a lot of overall strain. And so there's cases, if there's wind or earthquake loading, stuff like that, where you'd use it. But for a tunnel, that's just not what you should have done.
Well, especially for this is such a huge sustained load.
Yeah, and they knew that. So testing had already gone back to 1995 and 6 that showed that the faster setting epoxy did not meet the criteria for creep like the normal setting one that did. And I've got the data here showing the creep compliance. So think of this like the modulus. It's related to the modulus, right? It's showing you how much it's resisting deformation as a function of time. And by the time that you're out 25 years, the fast set epoxy is creeping at 10 times the rate. Like
wow.
It is dramatically faster.
It's not even close. And it's interesting that all this data is there because when I was reading through, there's actually a very good PowerPoint by NASA covering this. And they even mentioned that from their stuff, at least, the installation team claimed to be unaware of these properties, which is interesting when you also look in and you see they have all this data available.
And I get it. Like, there's a lot of different people, a lot of moving parts. Like, maybe it was a problem about communication, but whatever the problem, it led to this collapse.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, after the fact, they're checking things, and they found, they actually found this before the collapse. In 1999, they were actually pulling out bolts and realizing that big sections of the bolt were bare. They weren't covered with the epoxy everywhere. And that makes sense, right? You're doing this overhead. Who's ever done like drywall over your head? It sucks. It's not fun. This is kind of like that. You're hanging things above your head, and they're hoping that they can squirt the epoxy in there. And I get why a fast setting would be appealing, so it's not going to be leaking out on you or anything. But the problem is that there was a significant fraction of the epoxy that just wasn't in the hole. They found that a bunch of these holes, as they did the study, that because there existed holes in the epoxy, it led to a reduction in the pull-out capacity of about 38%, which makes sense why they were so much weaker. You didn't have the epoxy there. The epoxy that was there was more prone to creep, and so this was really just not the right way to do it. When they investigated the anchors themselves, they found the following. They said, the use of adhesive anchors was really subpar to other anchor types, like undercut, for example. They used the wrong epoxy. They used the fast setter instead of the slow. They did the diamond coring, which left a really smooth surface, and they didn't clean it right away. And because they didn't clean it right away, they didn't get that residue off, and so they didn't have a chance to properly clean it to get it to stick well, because you've got this dust in there, which prevents good adhesion. Yeah, it was delayed for up to a week, which made it difficult to remove that residue. and that there was insufficient amount of epoxy, which led to voids in the bolts and lower performance, and obviously that they weren't inspecting it like they needed to. So the National Transportation Safety Board, in their study after the accident, concluded these 4 points. They said overhead installation of these adhesive anchors is very likely to introduce voids, right? They said that design and construction engineers and builders, they have to know the complexities of epoxies and polymer products. This is why civil engineers, mechanical engineers, I know you guys hate material science as a course, but it is so important to understand the differences, because different ways of curing a polymer, for example, thermoset polymer, can give you totally different properties. They found that product testing laboratories should better assess long-term safety factors of anchors. Turns out that safety factor of 2 was not sufficient. That was not a way of being probabilistic and understanding the failure rates. And finally, that national standards were needed to come up with, basically, when you do tunnel finishes, including suspended ceilings, we need policy that dictates that.
Yeah, and this really just boils down to, obviously, a genuine, I think, communication issue when we look through a lot of things, because it's very clear that there was a lot of issues. I mean, they talk about that the documentation provided by the supplier wasn't clear about the differences. The contractors really never questioned it. The design people never questioned it. There was an independent verification. There was a whole bunch of issues. But this is just why it's really important to have that interdisciplinary stuff. You know, you need mechanical engineers, you need civil engineers, you need materials. They all need to be working together on a project. You can't do a project with just one type of engineer. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of exciting too, because it points to, it's tragic when something like this happens, but it prompts additional research. It led people to say, like, man, creep in epoxies is an issue, and how can we fix it? And there's, since that accident, there's been a bunch of cool papers. For example, I'm looking at one where they're actually introducing carbon nanoparticles in graphene as a way to adhere to it. And they find that, normally when you add secondary phases in thermoplastics, you get this dramatic improvement in properties. The strength and the ductility can simultaneously be increased, because when you add the additional filler material, it actually modifies the matrix. So normally, think of a typical composite. Your filler and your matrix have the properties they have, and they don't really change. It's just that you're leveraging the best of both worlds and how they're distributed. But in thermoplastics, adding this filler changes the matrix properties in a beneficial way. Unfortunately, it hasn't been shown to have as big of a benefit in thermosets, which is like our epoxies. But they have shown that when you change the cross-linking density, perhaps by being modified by nanofillers, then you can change the macroscopic properties. So in this paper, they add graphene, and they show that they can actually see significant creep rate reduction in these nanocomposites as they tune the amount and the dispersion of those graphene particles. And that's always one of the challenges, is if you add graphene, it has to actually be distributed nicely. It can't just cluster together, or it doesn't do what you think it's doing. So there's ways of doing it. There's ultrasonic mixing. There's high shear rate mixing. There's things that sort of work. But it's been nice to see that in the wake of this devastating accident, that smart engineering minds are trying to address that with new and advanced materials.
Yeah, and obviously even the company that sold the epoxy was prompted to improve their formulations and make it safer and do other things. So it's not, and I gotta say, when it was all said and done, it's a very sad tragedy. But the Big Dig Tunnel actually did succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I moved there in 2009, and this was just 2 years after the Big Dig was completed, and we used that all the time. It was a fantastic way to get to the airport. Congestion was way lower, I'm told, in the city, so I appreciate it being there. And it also is pretty iconic. For example, like that Leonard Zekim Bunker Hill Memorial Bridge. If you've been to Boston, you've seen it, that giant white one with the suspension cables. It is a beautiful, iconic bridge, so it's nice that they've done it from a use standpoint.
Yeah, it opened up almost 300 acres of open land. I don't know what all these different uses have been.
This was from the old highway that cut through the city?
Yeah, from destroying that old highway, the expressway is what it's called. And also, I think they had said that the big thing it did was it also removed all of the truck traffic from downtown Boston, because they didn't have to use that anymore. There was
Which
no
is related to noise and everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was certainly we can learn from this mistake and do similar projects that will make life better, but in a safe way.
Yeah, and it's a good example of, I think, the idea of going underground, and kind of supports how you can really free up more land by doing that. Good examples, trains or other things like that. But yeah, it has to be done in a way that's safe and smart, or else you also suffer the downsides like we had here. Because the cost overrun, a lot of it was probably associated with just how poorly planned it was.
Yeah. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. We really enjoyed learning about ourselves, doing some reading and getting ready for it. And we hope you're having a wonderful summer. We want to do a quick shout out to our sponsors. They are the ones who make the show possible. We are very grateful. So props to Materials Today. You know that we've been sponsored by them for quite a while. We hope that you'll check out materialstoday.com. You can stay up to date on all the things happening in material science. They obviously have some great articles. We've got a few that we drew from this week that were from the Elsevier catalog. So we're going to put those in the show notes. You can take a look at them. But we think that they're a great partner, and we appreciate what they do to make the show possible.
Our other sponsor is Cal Nano. If you've listened to the podcast, you've heard us talk about Cal Nano
We're
before.
Fans.
Yes. They can do some crazy spark plasma sintering on scales that you probably don't think is possible.
Cryomilling.
Yeah, they do everything, and they've been a really big supporter, and we really love working with them. So thanks to them as well. You can check them out at calnanocorp.com.
And obviously, we are also grateful to the people that made the music for this show. That is Alphabot and Kolobyte, so special thanks to them. And we are always looking for suggestions for episodes and reviews. So materialism.podcast@gmail.com. Shoot us an email, let's talk. And you can interact with us on social media. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, X.
Yeah,
We're easy to
LinkedIn.
find. LinkedIn.
Yep.
We would love to connect. Give us your ideas for episodes. Okay, we will see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening.
The inventors of fire, electricity, magnetism, iron, lead, glass, silk, cotton, the makers of tools, the captors of lightning, the architect, the engineer, the musician, are all beneficiaries of the materials of this world and are bound only by their imaginations in manipulating those materials.